Halliday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Halliday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Halliday. Halliday, bring it on.
You are tuned in to the Foul Weather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York.
Where have all the mallards gone? Seems like a common question nowadays, but it might surprise you that this was a magazine article title from Mississippi in Delta Wildlife magazine back in 2005. At that time, mallard populations had declined. Not as low as today, but they had declined. So let's be clear. We've been here before. In this episode, we aim to bring timely and important information about a topic that has been on the minds of many of us. Where have all the mallards gone? Among our favorite feedback emails we've gotten at the Foul Weather Podcast is this. The waterfowling gods have finally answered our prayers by sending us someone who is willing and able to write it in crayon on the wall so we can all understand. That's awesome. Thank you. Keep those great messages coming, folks. We really, really appreciate them. This message, along with others, also inspire us to continue to bring the science of duck migration, duck habitat management, and duck population biology to our listeners in a form that works. In this episode, we cover, are we shooting too many ducks? We also cover prairie conservation concerns, helping us understand where all the mallards have gone. I'm your host, Dr. Mike, coming to you from the home office in Jack's Reef. Before we enter that season of nesting by ducks, geese, and swans on this continent, I am making time in this special episode to delve once again into the current state of knowledge about how harvest does or does not drive waterfowl populations. I also will detail some little-known history about published research that has been largely ignored or at least not incorporated into AHM or adaptive harvest management for our new listeners. The intent is in no way to go into the weeds of the science, but instead bring the most important points to our friends across duck country. As a consumer of both scientific literature and social media chatter, I want listeners to understand that this episode will incorporate both of those information streams to bring you a cohesive comment that deeply appreciates the duck hunters' concerns for duck populations. The Foul Weather Podcast wants to note that we designated ourselves under the science category on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and we thought long and hard about that before launching. The reality, everything we produce is first grounded in science to inform our friends across duck country, and secondarily we aim to entertain. All other duck podcasts are under sports or wilderness or a similar category. As the host you listen to each week, I also want you to understand that I have worked in the U.S. and Canada in varying federal, state, nonprofit, industry, and academic capacities in the field of waterfowl and wetlands for probably 30 years now. I was the state waterfowl biologist for Maine for 3 years, so I do have knowledge about the process of AHM, flyway technical sections, and how science does or does not influence harvest regulations and policies. That all said, and thinking about what I noted earlier about trying to make this an easy podcast to follow, I'm not here to talk over anyone's head. I'm a duck hunter at heart. The Foul Weather Podcast would not be doing this without duck hunters at the center of it all. Without you, duck culture across duck country fails, and so does all the great habitat conservation that we as duck hunters drive. I deeply appreciate each and every passionate person across duck country that produces amazing content, bringing your passion for duck hunting to the masses. The fact that we bring that passion for duck hunting forward in different forms is what makes us a wonderful community of duck people across duck country USA. We should discuss and debate because it drives learning, and it drives our resource managers to do better, to look out for our interests, and to serve the people and the waterfowl resources that we all love. We should never lose focus on making duck hunting better, but we also need to understand that our waterfowl biologists across duck country are highly trained professionals, and nearly all, if not all of them, are duck hunters themselves. I don't know more about surgery than my surgeon. I don't know more about electrical work than my electrician. I can't drive a combine like an Iowa born and raised farm girl, so I find trust in those people. Ultimately, we should all be worried about sustaining duck culture across duck country, which without the ducks means nothing. So let's talk about the ducks first. First and foremost, in no way are duck populations doing great right now in the core of the prairies in Canada and the US. Twofold. It is dry. I mean, like 1980s epic dry on the prairies. And it is unlikely that anything is going to save that at this point in the season. We are likely going to be very dry in the prairies for nesting season 2024. Second, there is new chatter out there that is suggestive of an ultimate statement that harvest never drives duck populations, ever. Oh my goodness, people. Of course, at some level, duck harvest drives duck populations. But at the current level, as in kind of, non-market hunting levels, we are not near that level that would drive duck populations. So let's keep our heads screwed on straight when discussing the term ducks run guns, guns don't run ducks. It's a tagline that has obvious sideboards. Okay, so let's jump into some of the facts here. I'm going to base them on questions we've gotten across social media because we're guessing that there are very similar questions that you've asked in the blind, at camp in the kitchen, on social, or at home with friends. We're going to start with probably the most common question we see out there, and that also gets asked of us at the Foul Weather Podcast, is if AHM, or adaptive harvest management, is meant to be adaptive, why have we not adapted? Okay, a little weedy, but not too bad here into the science, right? Conceptually, AHM for mallards is based on density-dependent responses and whether harvest is additive or compensatory. Let's tackle density dependence first. This simply means that when there are few breeding ducks but lots of habitat, that hens can pick the best places and their population grows very quickly. I mean, like exponentially at times, right? The opposite of this is a high population when good nesting sites become less and less as the population grows, so you get less or even no ducks per additional hen returning to the breeding grounds. Harvest, in my opinion, is more complicated, and there's been a lot of discussion around additive or compensatory harvest. The idea is that under 100% compensatory harvest, for every duck you shoot during the hunting season, that duck would have died anyway. In complete contrast, additive harvest means that every duck you shot would have lived to breed. The reality is that every duck is different, and our current condition lives somewhere in between wholly compensatory and wholly additive. All right, so the question we hear is, given the population decline and loss of wetlands, why have we not adapted? Really? Simply, we've worked so closely within the sideboards of stability of that population that we never really tested AHM. AHM is conceptually a fantastic tool, but we can't learn from it if we never push it far enough. We never closed a season or opened it up wide enough to test these hypotheses about breeding ground dependence or impacts of harvest. We continue to play that safe ground. The reality? Our current harvest is relatively inconsequential. You would have to shoot the hell out of mallards to make a noticeable dent to inform the model, or you would have to close the season to detect the opposite. We live in the middle, which is a good place to be. Mallard numbers and other duck numbers will fluctuate, but they are easily within the realm of a strong conservation ethic in this country. In the meantime, we sustain duck hunting and duck hunters who pay for all this conservation in the first place. The AHM bus was a good bus to be on. It got us where we wanted to go. First and foremost, as waterfowl enthusiasts, we are conservation stewards. Second, we want duck culture to continue across duck country because all of that positive feedback loop has to offer. We are members of Ducks Unlimited and Delta Waterfowl. We volunteer at refuges. We put up duck boxes and mallard nesting structures. We work to have wetlands restored and saved. The need here is to sustain duck hunting culture to make more ducks, places for other wetland wildlife, and places for people to thrive alongside ducks. In the future, if you hear chatter about moving away from AHM, don't be afraid. It's all in good hands. You will continue to hear the term Integrated Population Models, or IPM, which is likely the next iteration of tracking duck populations and understanding drivers of ducks themselves. All right, so the second question here, and we're not quite taking these in like order of importance or, how often we get them. The AHM one that I just covered is probably the most common one we get. But number 2 is, if harvest wasn't the driver of duck populations, why do we have such a restrictive scaup bag limit and season length limit following the population in those number of scaup? Okay, good one. First of all, I've done some research myself on this, along with colleagues with implanted satellite telemetry units, and there were times when it was likely we were potentially overcounting scaup, and so the population decline is real. It might not be quite as drastic as what we saw, but it kind of looks like, if you look across time, that there's just 2 different levels of the numbers of scaup, of what there used to be and what there are now. And this is probably a largely a habitat-driven thing, right? We treat our coasts very poorly, and in some of our mid-continent lakes that used to be fishless no longer are. So there's some major landscape changes that scaup have been hit with, right? But this is a tough one because, I talk about the AHM bus, right? It's traveling really quick, and it's hard to even slow it down or turn it around. So this one's tough because it's about the AHM bus. If you were on that bus, it used harvest as the major lever for scaup decisions without great information about how harvest drove that scaup population. But groundbreaking research by, I'd say, the best of the best academics in 2016 noted, we conclude that hunting mortality played a minor role in affecting population changes of lesser scaup, and waterfowl managers could take a less cautious approach to harvest management, especially if recruiting or maintaining waterfowl hunters are viewed as important management objectives. Yet we still sit in an AHM framework that impacts the number of layout boats each year. I think we crushed diver hunting culture in areas with scaup limits and reduced season lengths that likely never had and still do not have an impact on the population. This is likely a clear case of the precautionary principle, and we have woefully injured diver hunting communities across this country. Question number 3, one from right at home. If harvest wasn't a driver, why did we go to 2 instead of 4 mallards in the daily bag in the Atlantic Flyway? Oh, my friends, this is a good one. And to be clear, because this is where I live and work with mallards a lot, and I'm not a mallard purist, but goodness, I love shooting them if you've listened to the podcast, and I love putting them on the grill. I follow the science on this one really closely, and that science is lacking. The reason to move from 4 to 2 mallards was precautionary, and it used a gross scale available take model as an interim option while they worked on an IPM for Atlantic Flyway mallards or Eastern mallards. The Atlantic Flyway now has a very defensible model for mallard harvest policy, but I continue to question the need for including harvest as a major lever, because it really appears that a major driver of this population is a decline in juvenile survival outside of the hunting season. So at a 4-bird bag limit, we can continue because if we don't shoot them, they die in the summer anyway. Okay, of course that is a simplification, but we still continue to throw in that heavy lever of harvest. The reality? From around 1998, when I left New York and then traveled across this continent until now, the mallard population declined for nearly 20 years before the Atlantic Flyway folks did a deep dive into saving a duck that is 25% of the Flyway's harvest. Why? Oh, good question. We've covered that in other ones. They were working on a multi-species model. When I say 25%, when you start getting further down the flyway, it's not a big percentage of folks harvest when you start getting, say, south of Maryland, Virginia. But for a lot of us folks at the northern end of the flyway, it's not a bread and butter duck, but boy, it as the season goes late, they matter, and they matter a lot, right? Mallards matter. But there's a better harvest strategy in place now, and we're back at 4 mallards, which is where we probably should have been all along. All right, question number 4 we get. If harvest doesn't drive mallard populations more than other species, then why do we have a hen mallard limit and not for, say, widgeon or gadwall? All right, listen close here. There is no empirical evidence that shooting hens has any measurable impact on the population. It may, but we can't detect it, which means it is likely not glaring in any way. Why the hen restriction then? There's lots of history there, but it's precautionary. And I've often heard from biologists the hunters would have our hides if we didn't have a hen limit. That said, shooting drakes seems like a very responsible thing to do considering the noticeable skew in sex ratios. There's just a lot more drake mallards out there than hens, and that's increasing, which would be expected with a declining habitat quality where hens, it's more risky to be a hen sitting on the ground for 30 days. That many males in the breeding population may also simply harass females, just harass hens, and decrease reproductive output. That entire system's complex, and I'll stop there for now. But we could very well actually help mallards, possibly, by shooting more of them, specifically males, right? Think about that. If there's a skewed sex ratio out there, and it's unhealthy for females to constantly be chased by males, then it might be possible that rather than say, hey, we should shoot less ducks as the population declines and there's more males per female, it actually might help the population to raise the bag limit and shoot more greenheads. Not females, but males. That's not going to happen, but it might help, right? All right, last one here until we kind of move on. Another great question. So what's up with pintails? Okay, that's a good one. I'm just going to say stay tuned, right? It's a great question. I think we're really in the middle of this one right now, and I don't think that reporting on it would do, the biologists themselves working on it or the pintails justice. So just stay tuned, folks. Thanks. I'm going to end this section on harvest by noting one very important fact. In the 1980s, when populations were low and we ended up with more restrictive seasons, we did not have the information we do now. The stuff I just reported to you, we didn't know. So stating that we should do as our forefathers did is not good advice. We should use the best information we have. So what is the harm in pulling the harvest lever? Why not be safe? Here's the punchline. A lot of y'all don't think about it. It implicates hunting as the driver of duck populations and provides ammunition for PETA people, HSUS, and anti-hunters in general. It is an admittance of guilt when in fact there is little to no evidence to support such guilt. So let's not admit guilt for driving duck populations when the science says otherwise. I do want to caveat this entire section about, waterfowl harvest, that waterfowl are diverse and some are more sensitive to harvest than others. For example, eiders and most geese reproduce at a much lower rate than our dabbling ducks, so we just can't shoot them as heavily because they don't replace themselves, right? But we have very conservative harvest strategies for these species because we know we have less margin of error. I want you to remember, too, that the Foul Weather Podcast has no agenda, right? We aim to entertain and inform, or inform and entertain, whichever way you want to put that together, for the greater good of duck people across duck country. There's also the comment from folks that duck season continues at 60-day plus and with liberal bag limits because the hunting industry is in the pockets of the decision makers. I'm not going to entertain that. It's laughable. Nothing is farther from the truth. Plain and simple, that's fake news. That's like the fake news of fake news in the duck world. The Foul Weather Podcast itself is a science-based podcast aimed to entertain and inform, and we are not influenced by anything but the science of duck migration and duck conservation. All right, cleared that. So what about prairie conditions, though? How can I help there? We get that question, too. How bad are conditions on the breeding grounds? The ducks going back north this year have a lower likelihood of encountering conditions that will make more ducks. I mean, like really lower likelihood. If you did not shoot that hen, she may make it back north. If she does, it's likely that she will not have her choice of places to nest near water to lead her brood to water and succeed at producing that next generation of ducks. So fewer mallards produce ducklings into the fall flight. That's the condition we're probably going to see, right? The condition we're likely to see are hens going back with fewer places to ensure that they produce ducks that end up in the fall flight and potentially in front of your blind. Next year, even under a cold winter, if that happens, you as a hunter are subject to more adults than juveniles, and your hunting success is likely to go down. Adult ducks just simply know how to not get shot to a large degree, right? In this case, your success went down because ducks run guns. That is, when the prairies were wet, when nutrients are released during that natural wet cycle, bugs grow, ducks eat bugs. Ducks need that protein from bugs to grow, become flighted, and fly south. And then we see a bumper crop of ducks, right? It will happen again. Ducks run guns, guns don't run ducks. Again, within the current context of the numbers of hunters and harvest. There is a very big but, though, here, right? But this happened. There's a very likely scenario that played out and continues to affect breeding ducks on the prairies. Not long after Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, ramped up and was primarily focused on putting grass back on the prairies, we also got a bunch of water back from snow cover around the same time. We ended up with a bumper crop of ducks, including mallards, because water plus grass equals ducks. Then, after the late 1990s, around 2000 through 2005, we went through a relatively short dry period. But that was buffered by the fact that CRP continued pretty strong and was concentrated on the prairies. Then, when water came back to the prairies, the duck population really went through the roof. Then the prairies started to get dry again. CRP was diversified to other parts of the country and less dedicated to ducks on the prairies, and the ethanol craze hit. In 1998, a good year for ducks, ethanol was 0.52 billion bushels of the 9.2 total billion bushels of corn, or about 5% at that time in this country, right? So corn growth for ethanol was about 5% of the corn at 0.52 billion bushels of the total 9.2 billion bushels of corn that was produced in this country. By 2023, that number for ethanol was 5.18 billion bushels of the 13.65 total bushels, or about 38% of the total. In fact, we've been steadily floating around 5 billion bushels of corn for ethanol since around 2010. For comparison, about 11% of corn is what we directly eat. So when you see corn, don't be like, that's food for me. It's not directly going to you in most cases. 37% is used as animal feed, so indirectly coming to you. And then we export around 12% or so. Obviously, these are going to fluctuate some year to year. In the Dakotas, in the core U.S. portion of our prairies, it's the same. About 40% of the corn goes to ethanol production. So the reality is what's going on in the prairies is not pretty. There really isn't much, if any, native prairie left, and what was left has seen rock pickers and corn put in its place. We've all seen a ton of drain tile go in rampantly. It's put in on the smaller, productive potholes, and they're drained into larger basins. With mallards doing better when more smaller temporary wetlands exist, this pretty much spells disaster, because even when the water comes back, it will drain that much more quickly into larger basins that are used by species like gadwall, which continue to do a bit better than some of these other species. So what's a duck to do? A hen mallard returning has less shallow potholes because of the drought that's compounded by drainage. She also has way less grass, largely affected by ethanol and diversification of CRP that is no longer focused heavily on producing ducks in the prairies. So if 50% plus of our mallards live 2 years or less, this is a fact, folks, right? Like the average age of a Drake mallard is like 1.4 years or something, basically meaning if you don't pass your genes on in the first year, you're done, right? So if 50% plus of our mallards live 2 years or less, and hens have to try to nest in compromised habitat, they're just not going to make it in a lot of cases. This is the idea of density-dependent loss in the prairies when stuff goes dry. Okay, so predator control, yeah. Not getting into it, but just try to scale that up to the size of the prairies. It's a big place, folks. The best bet is more grass. The water's going to cycle.
Today, the beverage aisle looks a lot different than it used to. America's beverage companies are working together. We're delivering the options everyone wants. In fact, nearly 60% of beverages Americans buy have zero sugar. You'll find more variety than ever, including more of your favorites, now available with zero sugar. You'll also find more sizes and clear calorie information on the front of every can, bottle, and pack. We know when it comes to finding balance, the more choices, the better.
So it doesn't take too many years to see a depressed duck population, and it isn't because you shoot them all. When the conditions are good, you see more ducks, and those ducks continue to produce more ducks. When the conditions are bad, you start to see less ducks, and those ducks can't produce more ducks because there just aren't the wetlands or grass for them to do so. It's actually really simple math, my friends. This is why, for generations, duck biologists have been saying that you just can't store ducks. It doesn't work. Yeah, there are some super hens out there, quote-unquote super hens, that are great at what they do and produce a bumper crop of ducklings each year, even when conditions aren't great. But they are few and far between. Ducks don't store. Yeah, some live longer than 2 years, but not much longer. And just because a few mallards have been known to live longer doesn't mean that old ducks drive duck populations. There just aren't enough of them. I also need to be clear that I very often talk like a good old boy from Arkansas when I say duck. When I say duck, if you think about this and I'm talking about the prairies, if I'm talking about gadwall specifically, I'll mix that in. But if I'm talking about a duck, I mean a greenhead, right? I mean a mallard. So last comment. Ducks will do very well as long as duck culture exists and continues as a positive voice for conservation. And these are not my words, but those of a guide in northern New York. If we put the energy we do into debating season lengths and bag limits, instead into habitat conservation, we would be in a much better place as duck hunters. Think about that for a second. Rather than spend all this negative energy on debating seasons and bag limits, which likely doesn't even affect the cycle of the numbers of ducks you see, and we took that energy and we focused on habitat conservation and uniting hunters, we would be in a lot better place as duck hunters. The ultimate driver of all of this, the culture of duck hunting across duck country USA, is twofold: habitat and duck people to make conservation happen. So number one, the Ducks Unlimited message, habitat. Number two, Delta waterfowl. We need duck hunters to make that duck conservation happen. My further recommendation, vote like ducks' lives depend on it, because they do. We need solid policies that keep grass on the prairies, and we need to reinstate the Clean Water Act in the way that it protects prairie pothole wetlands. The comment has been made that we can't regulate every last puddle. But please understand that ducks basically breed in large puddles, and they must exist for ducks to exist. Instant ducks just add water. All right, well, plus a whole hell of a lot of grass, too. Right now, under federal law, every prairie pothole, because they are not linked to a navigable waterway that's directly connected to that wetland, no pothole is protected by the Federal Clean Water Act. They can all be drained, plowed under, or filled. So let's focus our efforts on habitat and pushing politicians to protect vital prairie habitats. Let's support duck hunters. Let's not act like duck hunting drives duck populations, because that gives the antis fuel. Mostly, let's keep duck culture strong across Duck Country, USA. It's a pretty cool place to live. It's a pretty damn wonderful community of conservationists. We've saved ducks over and over again, and we're up against it today, I'd say. But I'm optimistic that we can get it done. Okay, so after this episode, the Foul Weather Podcast goes back to our wetland management series throughout the month of April and into summer breeding ground condition reports, and then into our hunting season duck migration forecasts, right? But we never walk away from a great topic like this. Thanks for listening, and as always, may your skies be filled, and shoot straight, my friends.